Tonight, we're stepping into the true Wild West. Not the glamorized Hollywood fantasy full of noble gunslingers and epic duels, but the raw, unforgiving version where just making it through the day was a win. You might think you've got what it takes to survive, but the truth is, they didn't call it wild for nothing. If you're vibing with these stories, dropping a quick like or even subscribing really helps keep them coming. I also love hearing from you all. So let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. It's always amazing to see this little worldwide family growing together around these tales. Now go ahead, dim those lights, maybe switch on a fan for some chill background noise, and let's ease into tonight's ride. We're diving into why surviving even a single day in the brutal American frontier might have been beyond your limits. So, congratulations, you've just opened your eyes in the American Wild West of the 1870s. The upside? You're about to live through one of history's most iconic eras. The downside? Your odds of making it through are already sinking fast. Even before you're fully awake, your senses are hit with the first challenge, the smell. Not that crisp scent of open land or fresh pine, but something far less pleasant. A thick mix of unwashed bodies, manure, and possibly raw sewage just hanging in the air. See, regular bathing wasn't really a thing back then. For most settlers, a proper wash was more of a rare event, maybe once a month if they were lucky. Some didn't bathe at all during the entire winter. Water was too precious to waste on cleaning when it was needed for drinking and cooking. As you get out of bed, which is probably just a lumpy straw mattress full of bed bugs, your entire body groans in protest. Every muscle aches. Life out here meant constant, exhausting physical work from sunrise to nightfall. No weekends, no time off, and definitely no such thing as back support. Whether you were farming, herding cattle, or buried deep in a mine shaft, your body was your only tool, and you used it hard until it gave out. You might think your modern grind is tough, but frontier work was a whole different beast. Endless hours of hauling water, digging, chopping, and plowing left even the fittest folks broken down by their 30s. Back then, making it to 35 years old was already above average. Standing barefoot on the cold dirt floor, you feel the bite of winter air, or maybe it's a sweltering summer and you're already drenched in sweat. Either way, you're not getting much relief. In the dead of winter, your log cabin might be colder inside than out. And if you had a fireplace, it probably burned out overnight to conserve wood. Central heating didn't exist, and you weren't layering in anything high-tech. Summer wasn't any better. No fans, no AC, just relentless heat and thick, sticky clothes clinging to your skin. Speaking of clothes, comfort wasn't even a consideration. Men had maybe 2 outfits, stiff canvas or denim trousers and coarse cotton shirts that scraped against the skin. Women wore layered clothing was the norm, no matter the season. Women had to endure multiple garments, chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long skirts that dragged through filth. Everything was rough, uncomfortable, and rarely washed. Those stylish, polished outfits you've seen in Western movies? Yeah, not even close to reality for most folks. Then your stomach starts to growl. It's breakfast time. Hopefully you like beans, dry biscuits, and maybe some burnt coffee, because that's probably what you'll be having. In fact, that same trio could show up for every single meal. The frontier diet was painfully repetitive and lacked basic nutrition. Fresh produce? Only around if you were lucky enough to grow or trade for it during the right season. Meat? Sure, when you had it, but it was usually preserved with heavy salt or smoke since there were no refrigerators. Diseases like scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, were widespread. People's gums would bleed and teeth would fall out, all from something we could now easily prevent. You might think the coffee would be a bright spot. After all, cowboys always seem to be sipping from steaming mugs in the movies. But nope. What you get is basically a blackened, boiled-to-death brew, bitter enough to make your face twist. To tone down the harshness, people sometimes tossed in things like crushed eggshells or even a pinch of salt. Still, the caffeine helped get you moving, so you chugged it and kept going. Before stepping outside, though, it was smart to inspect your boots. Scorpions, spiders, or snakes could have crawled in overnight, drawn by the warmth. Shaking out your shoes wasn't paranoia, it was survival instinct. A single bite could kill you if you were too far from the nearest doctor, and in most cases you were. Once you do step out, you're instantly reminded how vulnerable you really are. Sure, the open plains and wild terrain might look majestic, but this land didn't play around. One moment it was calm, and the next, boom, extreme weather would hit with zero warning. Blizzards, flash floods, scorching droughts, or even tornadoes could wreck your life in seconds. If you were caught unprepared, nature had no mercy. And even if you were living in a town instead of the wide open range, that didn't guarantee safety. Life in a frontier town brought its own hazards. Let's say today you're heading into one of these towns. As you approach, it quickly becomes clear that urban planning wasn't exactly a priority. Buildings were tossed up wherever people felt like it. There was no thought-out structure, no zoning, no sidewalks. The roads, just dirt paths that turned into rivers of mud after a rain or choking dust storms in the summer. The stench returns, stronger this time. Horses were the main form of transportation, and there was no one cleaning up after them. Manure covered the ground, often piling up knee-high in the busiest parts of town. No sanitation crews, no garbage disposal, just flies buzzing thick around every corner, drawn to the filth. As flies buzz around you and the stench worsens, it becomes clear why disease was such a constant threat in these towns. Walking down the main street, you pass the local saloon, probably one of the most active spots in town. But forget the glamorized scenes from old westerns. There's no polished wood, fancy piano tunes, or swinging doors. Most saloons were crude, single-room shacks with rough wooden bars and basic furnishings. And the booze? Definitely not smooth, barrel-aged whiskey. More like raw, unfiltered alcohol spiked with whatever was on hand, chewing tobacco, turpentine, pepper, even gunpowder. Just one sip could leave you blind if you were unlucky. And saloons weren't just about drinking, they were powder kegs of violence. The danger wasn't in dramatic high-noon showdowns. It came from drunken arguments that escalated in seconds, especially in a world where everyone was armed. Gun violence wasn't rare, but it also wasn't clean or choreographed. It was messy, spontaneous, and often over the pettiest of reasons. You'll notice that nearly everyone carries some kind of weapon, not always for self-defense from people, but for hunting or protection from wildlife. Bears, wolves, cougars, and snakes were real threats, especially while traveling through the wilderness. Being unarmed out here was just plain reckless. Surprisingly, though, some of the more infamous frontier towns like Dodge City or Tombstone had strict gun laws. Visitors were expected to hand over their weapons upon entering town. The legendary OK Corral shootout? It actually began because the Clantons refused to follow Tombstone's firearm rules. Those quick-draw duels in dusty streets? Total movie myth. Most shootings were ambushes or botched robberies. No honor, no dramatic flair, just fast and dirty violence. As you move further down the street, you pass the doctor's office, or what counts for one. Medical care on the frontier would be unthinkable by today's standards. Many doctors had little real education, and surgery was performed without anesthesia, aside from maybe whiskey or morphine. Forget sterilization. Tools were reused with no cleaning. An infected cut could easily cost you a limb or your life. Common cures included things like mercury, arsenic, or bloodletting, treatments that often made things worse. Women giving birth faced horrifying odds, especially in remote areas where maternal death rates reached 1 in 4. Dental care was just as grim. With no anesthesia, extractions were brutal, and most people lived with rotten, painful teeth for years until they finally fell out. Getting hurt or sick out here meant one thing. Your survival depended less on a doctor's skill and more on pure luck. Even a small injury could spiral into something fatal due to infection or poor healing. Broken bones rarely healed correctly, and the result was often a lifetime of pain and limited mobility. The saying, "only the strong survive," wasn't just a cliche here. It was reality. By now, your stomach's rumbling again, and it's time for lunch. You head to a local eatery, probably just a small room in someone's house where they cook for a fee. Don't expect a menu, just more of the same. Bland, tough meat that may or may not be spoiled, and mushy vegetables if any are available. Food hygiene was non-existent, so dysentery and food poisoning were just part of life. While you're eating, you catch fragments of conversation, talk of nearby Native American attacks, outlaw gangs, or someone disappearing after traveling alone. Though popular culture often exaggerated native attacks, the reality was more nuanced. In many cases, settlers in the U.S. military were the aggressors, pushing indigenous communities off their land. That conflict led to violence on both sides, but the systemic displacement of native people was the true root of the unrest. Outlaws, on the other hand, were a very real threat. In isolated areas, law enforcement was practically non-existent. A lone sheriff might be responsible for thousands of square miles. With such limited presence, justice was often delivered by vigilante mobs. Accused of horse theft or cattle rustling, you could find yourself swinging from a tree by sundown, trial or no trial. Guilt didn't matter as much as public opinion and raw suspicion. After lunch, you stopped by the general store to pick up a few supplies. The prices stop you in your tracks. Everything costs a fortune compared to what it would back east. Transporting goods was expensive and dangerous, and that cost trickled down to the buyer. A single can of peaches might set you back the modern equivalent of $20. Most settlers burned through their entire income just trying to survive, with little left for anything else. The store also reminds you of how deeply isolated life on the frontier could be. Mail came sporadically, and newspapers, when they arrived, were often weeks or months old. Information traveled painfully slow, and many people never heard from family again once they left for the West. This isolation wasn't just inconvenient, it took a serious psychological toll. Depression, alcoholism, and suicide were tragically common among settlers. As the afternoon wears on, clouds gather and the sky starts to darken. Out here, bad weather wasn't just uncomfortable, it could kill. With no forecasting, storms came out of nowhere. Blizzards stranded travelers until they froze. Tornadoes demolished entire towns with no emergency crews to help the survivors. Floods wiped out wagons, homes, and livestock. Droughts led to crop failure and widespread hunger. Even if you were lucky enough to own a house, it barely kept the elements out. Most frontier homes were thrown together using whatever was available, sod if you lived on the plains, logs in forested regions, or hastily nailed boards in town. These structures offered little protection. In winter, the inside could be colder than outside. In summer, sleeping upstairs meant sweltering heat all night long. With the storm approaching fast, you decide to hurry back to your cabin. On the way, you pass a group of men heading to the local mine. Mining was one of the most lethal jobs on the frontier. Accidents were constant. Cave-ins, toxic gas leaks, explosions from poorly handled explosives, machinery mishaps. And that's not counting long-term damage like black lung from coal dust or mercury poisoning from gold extraction. But honestly, even if you weren't a miner, you were still in danger. Farming involved brutal tools with no safety features. Ranchers dealt with massive, unpredictable animals that could crush you in an instant. Most grueling undertakings a person could face in the 19th century. The Oregon Trail wasn't just a scenic adventure. It was a long, perilous trek filled with hardship. If you were part of a wagon train, you'd be up before dawn, packing up camp and preparing for another punishing day of slow, bumpy travel. You'd walk most of the way to spare the animals, covering perhaps 10 to 20 miles a day, depending on weather, terrain, and luck. Logging, by the way, was just as deadly as mining or ranching, maybe even worse. It held one of the highest death rates of any job at the time. No matter what profession you worked in, the frontier made sure your risk of getting seriously hurt or killed was always looming. As you finally make it back to your little cabin, rain begins to fall, leaking through the crude roof. You place buckets around to catch the dripping water. Ironically, this is one of your better chances to refill your drinking supply. Clean water is incredibly rare out here. Most people drank from the same streams where they bathed, watered livestock, or even dumped waste. Waterborne illnesses like dysentery and cholera were constant killers. Sitting in your damp, drafty shelter, you think about how wildly different this is from the Wild West legends. There weren't any real heroes or villains, just everyday people trying to survive impossible odds. That anyone made it through these conditions is a testament to raw human grit. As night sets in, you're surrounded by darkness. There's no electricity, just the faint flickering glow of candles or oil lamps, and with every open flame comes the terrifying possibility of fire. Homes burned often, and entire towns were lost to blazes. There were no fire departments, no hoses, no backup. You fall into bed, utterly drained from just one single day. Your muscles scream from the labor, your stomach churns from questionable food, and your brain is fried from having to be constantly alert. As you lie there listening to the wind whip around your cabin, you wonder if you'll even make it through tomorrow. The wilderness feels enormous, relentless. Survival out here wasn't a given. It was something you had to fight for. Every hour, every step, every breath. The wind howls louder, rattling the walls and making you feel tiny in the face of nature's fury. If morning comes, it'll bring all the same threats, and maybe new ones you haven't yet imagined. In this place, survival wasn't promised. It was earned, painfully, every single day. The light creeping through the cracks in your cabin walls wakes you from another rough night. Your joints are stiff, your body's sore, but you don't have time to dwell on it. The West doesn't wait. You rise, still haunted by yesterday's experiences, bracing for whatever comes next. Let's say you decide to leave town today. Maybe you're setting out for another settlement, joining a wagon train, or just exploring the unknown. Traveling across the frontier in the 1870s was nothing like modern trips. Sure, the Transcontinental Railroad had connected the coast by now, but unless you were wealthy or traveling between big cities, you likely couldn't afford to ride it. Most people moved on foot, on horseback, or in wagons. If you had a horse, consider yourself lucky. They were pricey and costly to maintain. A decent horse could cost you several months' pay, and that didn't even include saddles, tack, or feed. Medical care for animals was practically non-existent. If a horse got injured, you often had no choice but to put it down. Riding wasn't smooth either. Saddles were made for practicality, not comfort. Long rides left even seasoned riders sore, bruised, and exhausted. Plus, horses spooked easily. A sudden noise or rattlesnake could send you flying, and if you broke a bone out here, help was probably hours or even days away. If a horse was out of reach, maybe you traveled by wagon. But forget those cheerful images of families rolling across sunny meadows. Wagon travel was hellish. The wooden wheels offered no real suspension, and every bump, rut, and rock slammed through the vehicle and into your spine. The bone-rattling ride caused nausea, headaches, and back pain. Rain turned trails into swamps that could trap your wagon axle deep in muck. Dry spells kicked up choking clouds of dust. Breakdowns were constant. A busted axle, a cracked wheel, or a lost part could leave you stranded in the middle of nowhere. And repairs? You better have the tools, skills, and spare wood, because no one's coming to tow you. Let's say you're headed west, to California or Oregon, with a group of pioneers. You've joined a wagon train setting off on the famous Oregon Trail. That 2,000-mile journey ahead of you? It's only just beginning. Wild West was one of the most dangerous undertakings of the 19th century. Between the 1840s and 1860s, nearly 400,000 people attempted the Oregon Trail. But for roughly 1 in 10, the journey ended in death. The trail became known as the longest graveyard in the nation. Some estimates suggest that for every mile of the 2,000-mile journey, 10 to 15 people died. That's a grave every 350 feet. The route was lined with makeshift wooden crosses, stone cairns, and shallow, nameless graves. Families often forced to bury loved ones and keep moving, with no time to mourn. The leading cause of death? Disease. Cholera, spread through contaminated water, was the most feared. It came on fast. Violent diarrhea and vomiting could drain a person of life in just hours. One moment, someone was fine. By nightfall, they could be gone. There was no real treatment. A cholera outbreak could wipe out entire wagon groups within days. Other illnesses like typhoid, dysentery, and mountain fever also tore through families, especially targeting children. Many parents lost more than one child before the journey was over. Medical knowledge on the trail was almost non-existent. Cures ranged from herbal poultices to drinking mercury mixtures, remedies that often worsened the situation. Then there were the rivers. Countless crossings had to be made along the trail, and few wagons were made to handle water. Some areas had ferries or shallow fords, But in many cases, families had to caulk wagons and float them like makeshift boats. It didn't always work. Entire wagons capsized, drowning both people and animals, along with destroying supplies they couldn't afford to lose. Rivers like the Platte, Columbia, and Snake were responsible for hundreds of deaths. Contrary to myths, Native American attacks were rare on the Oregon Trail. In fact, many tribes offered aid, traded food, or helped migrants across dangerous terrain. Most deaths were from avoidable accidents, being run over by wagon wheels, trampled by animals, or falling victim to accidental gunfire. People carried guns for protection and hunting, but most had never used them before, leading to deadly mishaps. Mentally, the toll was enormous. Families had to bury spouses, children, and friends, then press on, often within the hour. There was no time to grieve. Every delay increased the risk of hitting the mountain passes too late when winter snow made them impassable. The combination of grief, exhaustion, and fear pushed many to their breaking point. Some couldn't take it and chose suicide. Even if you reached California or Oregon in one piece, you weren't guaranteed a better life. Many arrived sick, broke, and starving. The new land, full of promise, often held more hardships. No jobs, harsh climates, and growing competition made it clear that the journey was just the beginning. But let's say you weren't traveling that far. Even a trip to a nearby town could be full of danger. Outlaws were a constant worry, especially for small groups or solo travelers. Stagecoach robberies, though dramatized in pop culture, were real enough to warrant concern. Nature, however, remained the deadliest threat. A flash flood could appear from nowhere and sweep you away. The summer sun in desert regions could kill you from dehydration. Winter brought its own nightmares, blizzards that trapped people for days or weeks. The infamous Donner Party proved just how desperate things could get. Some survivors resorted to cannibalism to stay alive after getting snowbound in the mountains. Navigation was another deadly challenge. With no GPS, no reliable maps, and few road signs, travelers relied on vague directions, shifting landmarks, and the memory of hired guides, who sometimes didn't even know the way themselves. Getting lost wasn't just inconvenient, it could mean death by starvation or exposure. As your journey continues, you begin to notice something the movies often leave out. The Wild West was remarkably diverse. It wasn't just rugged white settlers and gun-slinging cowboys. Chinese immigrants worked tirelessly on railroads, in mines, and ran small shops. Mexican families had been in the American Southwest for generations, long before it was annexed by the U.S. Black cowboys, often overlooked in fiction, made up roughly a quarter of ranch workers in some areas. Immigrants from Europe, Germans, Irish, Italians, Scandinavians, brought their cultures and traditions with them, shaping the communities that rose from the dust. And long before any of them arrived, Native American nations had lived on and cared for this land for thousands of years. But don't mistake diversity for equality. Life on the frontier was deeply unequal, and violence rooted in race and power was all too common. Chinese workers were paid less, forced into the most dangerous jobs, and subjected to harsh discrimination. Mexican landowners saw their property taken through shady deals or outright theft, backed by a system that favored settlers. Mexican-American War-era Black Americans who moved west to escape Southern racism often encountered new but equally harsh forms of discrimination. Despite their significant roles in ranching, mining, and building communities, they were frequently denied economic opportunities and social inclusion. Native Americans, meanwhile, faced devastation as white settlement expanded. From a pre-colonial population of about 15 million, their numbers dropped to under 300,000 by 1900 due to disease, warfare, forced relocations, and the systematic elimination of their food sources, especially the buffalo. U.S. policies displaced Native peoples onto reservations with poor land and limited resources. Treaties were repeatedly broken whenever valuable assets were found on their lands. Native children were forcibly taken and sent to boarding schools aimed at erasing their culture under the motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Hollywood's portrayal of cowboys and Indians oversimplified these interactions. In reality, many Native nations initially tried to coexist with settlers, but violence often erupted after ongoing treaty violations and land encroachments. Women on the frontier also lived lives very different from the ones shown in Western films. Far from being passive or fragile, they performed exhausting physical labor while facing strict societal expectations. Alongside housework, cooking, and child rearing, they worked the land, raised animals, and protected their homes. Their days started before sunrise and ended late at night, often without rest. Some had to deliver babies, fight off wild animals, and run farms or businesses alone after becoming widows. Despite their vital contributions, women had limited legal rights. In most places, they couldn't vote, own property independently if married, or gain custody of their children after divorce. Domestic abuse was rarely prosecuted. Unmarried women had few career options, with teaching being one of the few respectable paths, though it paid less and required women to quit upon marriage. Some women gained financial independence through nursing, running boarding houses, or starting businesses like dressmaking. Others, known as soiled doves, turned to prostitution out of necessity, facing abuse, disease, and social rejection, even if they earned well. Nonetheless, some women experienced more freedom in the West than in the East. Due to the scarcity of women, they had more choices in marriage and sometimes better treatment, as towns sought to attract female settlers. Territories like Wyoming and Utah granted women voting rights long before the 19th Amendment in recognition of their importance to frontier life. As the day progresses, you may wonder how law enforcement worked in such a seemingly wild environment. The reality varied greatly by region. Larger towns had some organized policing, but vast rural areas had little or no official security. County sheriffs were elected to maintain order over enormous regions and often couldn't patrol regularly. They frequently deputized locals during emergencies, forming posses to chase criminals or handle violence. Town marshals managed law within city limits, sometimes under equally challenging conditions. Law enforcement in the frontier varied greatly depending on the location. Larger towns usually had a few deputies assisting town marshals, but in more remote areas, law enforcement was sparse. The job was risky and paid poorly, attracting both sincere public servants and those who craved power. Some, like Wyatt Earp, moved between law enforcement and shady dealings. Federal marshals had broader authority, but were limited in number and focused on major crimes across jurisdictions. The Hollywood image of lone marshals restoring order was mostly fictional. In places with little to no formal law enforcement, communities often took justice into their own hands. Vigilante groups sometimes enforced order, but also fell into mob violence and personal revenge. Contrary to the myth of fast-draw shootouts, most violence was unremarkable and usually caused by alcohol, domestic disputes, or arguments over property. Punishment was severe. Hanging was common for crimes like murder, rape, or horse theft. Jails were often unsanitary and deadly, so many towns opted for swift executions over incarceration. By evening, travelers looked for shelter. If a town was nearby, they might find a simple hotel or boarding house. These accommodations were basic, beds often shared with strangers, thin walls, poor hygiene, and communal outhouses. Lighting came from candles or oil lamps. A night stay could cost 25 cents to $1, a big expense for many, so people often slept in barns, stables, or outdoors. In remote areas, camping was the only option. Campers needed to build a fire, cook from limited food supplies, and sleep on the ground. Native peoples and experienced scouts had the knowledge to do this safely, but settlers often made risky mistakes. A fire too large could cause a devastating wildfire, too small, and someone could freeze. Cooking was tricky, often leaving food undercooked and burned at the same time. As night deepened, unfamiliar sounds filled the dark: coyotes, birds, wind through trees. For people used to modern comforts, the silence and pitch-black surroundings were unsettling. Many feared what might come in the night: wild animals, venomous creatures, or surprise attacks. Even when nothing happened, the anxiety wore people down. Frontier journals often described exhaustion not just from physical effort, but from the constant mental strain. Lying under the stars, travelers had time to think. Life on the frontier was nothing like what movies later portrayed. It was hard, risky, and uncomfortable. Skills like navigating without maps, fixing broken gear, or safely using weapons were essential, and mistakes could be fatal. As darkness settled in, so did the weight of a journey, not just through land, but through a life vastly different from modern comfort. The noises around you grow louder. Tomorrow holds new challenges. If you survive the night, you might reach your goal, or become another forgotten grave on the trail, one more casualty in the dangerous tale of westward expansion. The Wild West didn't tolerate weakness and offered no second chances. Every day you survived was a battle won against impossible odds. A new day rises on the frontier, and you've made it through the night, a small but meaningful victory. As you stretch and shake off sleep, you wonder where this journey might lead next. Maybe today you'll try your fortune in one of the booming mining towns that promise instant wealth. You've heard the tales from California, Nevada, and Colorado, stories of regular men finding massive gold nuggets and becoming rich overnight. But those stories rarely mention the harsh truths behind the dream. If you decide to try mining, first, you'll have to find land worth claiming, a task that's become harder by the 1870s as most rich areas were already taken. If you find a promising spot, you'll need to officially register it and pay high fees. Then the true struggle begins. Placer mining, searching for loose gold in streams, means spending hours bent over freezing water, panning through sediment. Your hands will crack and bleed, your back will throb, and you'll be lucky to find gold dust worth mere cents. If you go into hard rock mining, the dangers only increase. Tunnels often collapse without warning, crushing workers. Toxic gases silently fill the shafts, suffocating those inside. Blasting with explosives causes frequent injuries and deaths. Lost limbs, damaged hearing, and flying rocks were constant threats. Even if you avoid accidents, long-term exposure leads to deadly diseases. Breathing fine dust causes silicosis, slowly choking miners to death. Mercury used in gold processing damages the brain and nerves. Lead and copper poisoning causes chronic illnesses. With no safety laws and careless mine owners, injuries were routine. Medical care was poor, and a serious injury usually ended your mining life with no help or compensation. And for all this suffering, most miners barely made enough to survive. By the 1870s, most worked for companies, earning just $2, $3 a day for 10 to 12 hours of brutal labor. Ironically, people around the miners, store owners, bar owners, and prostitutes often made more money than the miners themselves. Mining towns were wild and violent. Populated mostly by young, single men doing dangerous work, they were filled with alcohol, fights, and crime. Hygiene was terrible. Trash and waste filled the streets, spreading diseases like typhoid, cholera, and dysentery. The smell during summer was unbearable, and flies made things worse. Even if you found gold, selling it wasn't easy. Many towns had no banks, forcing miners to carry their gold, making them robbery targets. Some stores bought gold but paid much less than its real worth. Where banks did exist, they were risky. Many collapsed or were run by fraudsters who vanished with people's money. Paper money varied in value depending on the bank that printed it. Counterfeits were everywhere. Only gold and silver coins were reliable, but dangerous to carry. After seeing the dangers and disappointment of mining, you might turn to ranching. The cattle business was thriving in the 1870s. Cowboys drove herds to railroads for eastern markets, leading to long and dangerous cattle drives. Cowboys spent all day on horseback, facing storms, predators, and deadly stampedes. At night, a sudden noise could send the herd into chaos, forcing cowboys to ride into the dark to calm them down, risking their lives. Ranch life wasn't easier. The work was nonstop: branding, fixing fences, herding cattle, and surviving harsh seasons. Cowboys earned $25 to $40 a month with basic food and shelter. Bunkhouses were crowded and filthy. Meals were repetitive and bland. Owning a ranch required money for land, supplies, and feed. Wealthy ranchers hired gunmen to protect their interests, sparking violent range wars. Despite everything, some preferred ranching for the open skies and sense of independence. But by the late 1870s, barbed wire and expanding railroads began ending the open range lifestyle. No matter the path you chose, life on the frontier was a constant test. Each morning was uncertain, every day was a fight to survive, and in the Wild West, nothing was promised. Creating opportunities on the frontier might seem like a healthier and more profitable alternative to mining. Ranching did avoid some mining hazards, but it came with its own set of challenges. Starting a ranch demanded a lot of money. Land, livestock, equipment, and structures all required big investments. Many hopeful ranchers took on heavy debt, relying on favorable weather and good market conditions. Unfortunately, nature often worked against them. Droughts ruined grazing lands and dried up water supplies, forcing ranchers to watch cattle die or sell them at huge losses. Severe winters like the Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887 killed up to 90% of northern cattle. Disease outbreaks such as Texas fever and anthrax wiped out herds quickly, and there were no treatments available. Predators, poisonous plants, injuries, and quicksand also took a toll. Cattle drives were not the romantic adventures often portrayed. Moving herds over long distances was exhausting and dangerous. Cowboys, mostly poor young men, many of whom were black, Mexican, or mixed race, worked grueling 20-hour days for about $30 a month. They dealt with dangerous river crossings, deadly stampedes, poor diets of beans, salt pork, and biscuits, and limited medical care. Many died young due to accidents, exposure, or violence. Farming, while seemingly safer, wasn't much easier. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres to settlers who improved the land over 5 years. But in dry regions, this amount of land often wasn't enough to support a family. Many settlers had no experience with dry farming, and Eastern methods didn't work. Building shelter usually meant sod houses, dark, damp, insect and snake-infested structures that required constant upkeep. Breaking the land for crops was backbreaking, often taking a year just to prepare a few acres. Droughts, floods, frost, grasshopper swarms, and illness all threatened survival. Women worked through pregnancies and childbirth due to the nonstop demands. Injuries from tools or animals were common, and many died from farm accidents or grain storage collapses. Isolation caused severe psychological strain, especially for women, sometimes leading to abandonment or suicide. Even if crops were successfully grown, selling them was a challenge. Poor transport, lack of refrigeration, and low crop prices imposed by big companies made it hard for small farmers to profit. By the 1870s, some people turned to wage labor in towns and industries as a more stable option. While it reduced some physical and financial risks, it brought new dangers. Frontier factories and railroads had little to no safety standards. Workers suffered severe injuries from machines, and construction and railroad work often led to fatal falls or explosions. Chinese railroad workers were given the most dangerous tasks, like handling explosives. Long workdays, low pay, child labor, and no legal protections were the norm. Employers could cut wages or fire workers without warning. Trying to unionize often led to blacklisting. In company towns where employers controlled everything, workers had almost no rights or options. Workers in lumber regions often lived in company housing, paid inflated prices at company stores, and were sometimes compensated with company-issued script instead of legal money. This system trapped many in debt, making it almost impossible to save or escape. Regardless of the work, mining, ranching, farming, or wage labor, life on the frontier deeply affected people in ways that would seem unfamiliar today. One key difference was how people related to time. Unlike the strict schedules of the modern digital era, frontier life followed natural rhythms, daylight, seasons, and weather patterns. Without electricity, most woke at dawn and slept after sunset, and work hours stretched or shortened with the season. Labor was measured by task completion, not hourly shifts, and people often worked from sunrise to nightfall during peak times like harvest. Winters brought slower periods with little to do. Punctuality had little meaning in daily life. Most people had few clocks and didn't need precise timing. Time references like morning or after dinner were usually enough. Only stagecoaches and railroads introduced strict schedules to the region. For entertainment, frontier folks relied on simple, low-energy activities after long workdays, chatting by the fire, storytelling, card games, or music when instruments and musicians were available. Fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars often accompanied dances. Books were rare and shared widely. One might be read aloud to neighbors or passed around until it fell apart. Newspapers were read over and over. Sports existed in basic forms: baseball with minimal gear, horse racing, wrestling, and shooting contests. Children played simple games like tag, hide and seek, or stickball using found objects. Holidays and community events were vital for social life. The 4th of July brought people together from far away for food, speeches, games, and dancing. Harvest festivals celebrated the end of critical labor, and religious holidays offered both spiritual focus and rest. At day's end, frontier life reminded you of how tough things truly were: constant risk, hard work, and little comfort. Survival demanded physical strength, practical skills for every kind of emergency, and strong mental resilience. As night fell, the silence was deep. No cars, machines, or electronics, only the wind, insects, and birds. This intense quiet, unfamiliar to modern life, was both calming and eerie. Under a brilliant night sky untouched by light pollution, you'd see the Milky Way stretch across the sky, just as people had for generations. With morning came hunger, a constant reality. The food in the 1870s West was nothing like today's varied, easy meals. Game like deer, elk, rabbit, and birds was available for skilled hunters, but hunting used precious ammunition and time, which many couldn't spare. Most families relied on what they could grow, preserve, or buy in bulk. Staples included beans, corn, and pork, high in calories but low in variety and nutrients. Fresh produce was only available in season. In winter, people often went months without it. This caused widespread nutritional problems like scurvy, leading to bleeding gums, loose teeth, joint pain, and even death. Children's growth suffered, and adults developed chronic issues. Food preservation was necessary without refrigeration. Meat had to be eaten fast or preserved by smoking, salting, or drying, which altered taste, reduced nutrition, and added excess salt, contributing to health issues. Women spent huge amounts of time preserving food during harvests to survive harsh seasons. Workers in lumber regions often faced harsh conditions, paying inflated prices at company stores, living in company-owned housing, and sometimes receiving wages in company-issued currency instead of real money. This trapped them in a cycle of debt that made escaping nearly impossible. Whether someone mined, farmed, ranched, or worked for wages, life on the frontier was a disorienting experience compared to today. Time was not divided into exact hours and minutes, but followed the natural rhythms of daylight and seasons. Without electricity, people typically woke at dawn and slept after sunset, with daily schedules shifting through the year. Work wasn't about timed shifts, but about completing tasks, plowing fields, moving cattle, or harvesting crops. During busy seasons, people worked from morning until night without breaks. In winter, work slowed, especially in rural areas where little needed to be done. Punctuality wasn't a major concern. With few clocks, people used loose time references like morning or after dinner. Only stagecoaches and trains introduced more precise timekeeping. Leisure was simple and shaped by exhaustion. People gathered for conversation, storytelling, or card games in the evenings. If instruments were around, music and dancing were enjoyed. Books were rare and often shared, read aloud to groups, or passed from home to home. Newspapers were read cover to cover for news beyond the local area. Sports were simple. Baseball played with makeshift gear, horse racing, wrestling, and shooting contests that also tested useful skills. Kids played low-resource games like tag, hide and seek, and stickball. Community events were special. Independence Day brought crowds for food, speeches, and dancing. Harvest festivals and religious holidays offered both social connection and rest from labor. As night came, the silence was overwhelming compared to today's noisy world. Just wind, insects, and birds. People needed intense physical endurance, practical survival skills, and strong mental resilience to cope with constant hardship. These weren't romanticized heroes, but real individuals surviving with limited resources. One undeniable beauty they enjoyed was the night sky, free from artificial light, revealing the Milky Way in all its glory, an experience that deeply connected them with nature and history. Morning brought hunger, always present on the frontier. Food in the 1870s was nothing like today's diet. Game like deer or rabbit was common, but hunting took time and bullets, both scarce. Most relied on staples like beans, corn, and pork, high calorie but boring and lacking key nutrients. Fruits and vegetables were seasonal, and winters lacked fresh produce, causing nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy and other deficiency diseases were common. Without fridges, meat was preserved by smoking, salting, or drying, which altered taste and nutrition. Preserved foods often caused health issues like high blood pressure. Women spent huge amounts of time preserving food, pickling vegetables, drying fruits, or storing root crops underground. Improper storage could lead to spoilage or poisoning, and pests like rats and insects were unavoidable. People accepted that their food would contain some contamination. Cooking was physically demanding. Meals were made over open flames or stoves, needing constant fuel. In places without firewood, people burned buffalo manure or grass. Water had to be fetched by hand from far-off sources. Despite all this, meals were basic and repetitive. Spices were rare, sugar and coffee were luxuries, and fresh milk was limited to families with cows. Most kids grew up with bland, repetitive diets. While obesity was rare due to limited food and constant work, malnutrition was widespread. Raising children in the frontier brought its own challenges. Childhood was not about play. It was about contributing to the family's survival. Kids as young as 6 or 7 did real work like gathering eggs or watching siblings. By 10 or 12, most children worked alongside adults. Boys learned farming or trade skills by doing. Girls learned homemaking skills, far beyond modern chores, directly from their mothers. People preserved fruits with vinegar or fermentation and dried them using sugar if it was available. Root vegetables were stored in underground root cellars to keep them cool. These preservation methods weren't optional. They were essential for surviving winter. However, storing food came with challenges. While well-preserved food could last a long time, mistakes in the process could lead to spoilage or deadly food poisoning. Stored food also attracted pests. Rats, mice, and insects would eat part of the supplies and contaminate the rest with their droppings. Many frontier families just accepted that their flour, beans, and staples would contain some amount of insect parts and rodent waste. Cooking was far more labor-intensive than it is today. Meals were made over open fires or wood stoves that needed constant attention and fuel. In areas where wood was scarce, women and children spent hours gathering buffalo dung or twisted grass to use as fuel. Water had to be carried from wells or streams, often hundreds of pounds each day, for cooking, cleaning, and drinking. Even after all this effort, meals were plain and lacked variety. Spices were expensive and used sparingly. Sugar and coffee were saved for special occasions. Fresh milk was only available if a family had a cow, and only when the cow was producing. Most children on the frontier grew up eating repetitive, simple meals that modern nutritionists would criticize. Despite the limited diet, obesity was almost non-existent. The combination of little food, minimal sugar, and constant hard work kept most people thin. But being thin didn't mean being healthy. Malnutrition was common even when people got enough calories. Beyond food, raising kids on the frontier was very different from today. Childhood was not a protected phase. It was about survival. Kids as young as 6 or 7 did real work like tending animals, collecting eggs, watching younger siblings, and helping with chores that freed adults for heavier labor. By age 10 or 12, kids worked nearly at adult levels. Boys followed their fathers into fields or workshops, learning through doing. Girls worked with their mothers, mastering tasks like making clothes, preserving food, and making soap and candles, skills crucial to survival. Children were not shielded from life's harshness. They witnessed birth, death, animal slaughter, and violence. They were expected to face these realities, not be protected from them. Education was limited and inconsistent. In towns, schools operated a few months a year, usually in winter when farm work slowed. A single teacher, sometimes barely educated, taught kids aged 5 to 17 in one room. Conditions were tough, cold in winter, hot in summer. Supplies were minimal, reused slates, a few shared books, and very little paper. Physical punishment was normal, with beatings given for even small mistakes. In remote areas, there were no schools at all. Some parents taught at home using any books they had, but many kids learned only basic reading and math. Instead, they were taught survival skills, how to read the weather, hunt, grow food, treat wounds, and more. Child death rates were devastating. About 1 in 4 children died before becoming adults. The first 5 years were most dangerous, with diseases like measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and whooping cough killing many. Accidents also claimed lives, as child safety wasn't a concept. Kids grew up watching siblings die, and parents expected child loss, often giving the same name to a new baby if an older one had died. Healthcare was also drastically different. If you got sick or hurt in the 1870s West, you probably wouldn't see a trained doctor. Doctors were rare, and those available had little training. Their knowledge was based on outdated ideas like balancing bodily fluids. Without doctors, most people relied on home remedies and folk medicine passed down through generations. Some herbal treatments helped, but many were useless or harmful. Common practices included bloodletting, harsh purgatives, and applying harmful substances to wounds. Opium-based laudanum was widely used for pain, leading to addiction. Mercury was used for many illnesses despite being toxic. Essential goods like clothing, preserved food, candles, and soap were produced locally. Children were exposed early to life's harsh realities, witnessing births, deaths, animal slaughter, and community conflicts. Rather than being shielded, they were expected to adapt. Education on the frontier was inconsistent and limited. In towns, schools ran only during winter when farm work slowed. One underqualified teacher taught all ages in a single room with poor heating and ventilation. Supplies were few: shared books, reusable slates, and scarce paper. Corporal punishment was the norm for even minor rule breaking. In remote places, schooling might not exist at all. Some families taught children at home using whatever books were available, but education focused more on practical survival skills, weather reading, animal tracking, farming, treating injuries, than academic subjects. Child death rates were extremely high. About 1 in 4 died before adulthood, especially in the first 5 years. Diseases now easily treated, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, were deadly. Accidents were common due to lack of safety awareness. Children regularly saw siblings die. Parents expected losses and often reused names of dead children. The ever-present threat of death shaped a different emotional world. Medical care was vastly different from today. Most communities had no doctors. Those who practiced had little training and outdated knowledge, relying on theories like humoral balance. Home remedies and folk medicine, mainly from women healers, were common. Some herbal treatments helped, but many were harmful, like bloodletting, purgatives, or applying infected substances to wounds. Opium-based laudanum was overused, causing addiction. Mercury was given for various illnesses despite its toxicity. Medication was unregulated, often impure and dangerous. Many cure-all medicines were just alcohol. Surgery was painful and crude. Without anesthesia or sterilization, infections were common. Amputation was the usual solution for serious injuries. Childbirth was particularly dangerous. Many women gave birth at home without medical help. Complications often led to the deaths of mothers, babies, or both. Maternal death rates were 1 in 100 births, over 100 times today's rate. Many men raised children alone after losing their wives. Poor nutrition, hard labor, little health care, and primitive treatments led to short lifespans. Life expectancy was under 40 years, and even survivors often faced chronic illness by age 50. Isolation was another major hardship. With no fast communication, people relied on slow, unreliable mail. News traveled late and often inaccurately. This made people focus only on local events. Isolation hit women especially hard. Many lived alone for long stretches while their husbands were away. Diaries often mentioned deep loneliness and mental strain, sometimes resulting in what was called prairie madness, severe depression, anxiety, even psychosis. Some became violent or took their own lives. Others simply gave up and returned east. Even in towns, visiting neighbors took time and effort. Social life centered on churches, seasonal events, or community tasks. Churches were more than religious centers. They were places for socializing, education, and mutual support. Religious leaders also served as teachers, mediators, and organizers. Founding schools, churches, or meeting halls marked a shift from temporary camps to lasting communities. Forming local governments, however basic, also signaled the start of structured society. Survival required group effort. Barn raisings, house constructions, shared harvesting, and search parties were common. These cooperative traditions showed that no one could survive alone. While frontier life celebrated self-reliance, community support was just as important. Both shaped the culture of the time and still influence American views on independence and cooperation. As another day in the Wild West ends, you reflect on the mental and emotional strength needed to survive in such conditions. The people of the American frontier were not superhuman. They endured immense hardship and pressure. Still, many adapted, developing resilience and finding moments of meaning and joy. Nightfall brings a deep silence, offering a glimpse into a world that was both recognizable and entirely foreign. A world where survival demanded constant effort, comfort was rare, and death was a frequent reality. As you drift into sleep, thoughts linger on those who chose or were forced into this life. What gave them the strength to endure blizzards, droughts, illness, and loss? What would they think of today's world, built on their labor and sacrifice? These thoughts carry into dreams filled with vast plains, towering mountains, and the faces of those who shaped the West, not through gunfights, but through persistent daily struggle. Their story, stripped of Hollywood glamour, highlights the adaptability and courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Morning arrives on your final day in the Wild West. The golden light reveals the striking beauty that drew many settlers. Vast, rolling prairies, towering peaks, and deep canyons. But this relationship with nature was rooted in conquest, not preservation. Forests were clear-cut, wildlife was hunted to near extinction, and streams were destroyed in pursuit of resources. One of the most extreme examples of this exploitation was the near extinction of the American bison. From an estimated 30 to 60 million in the 1700s, the population fell below 1,000 by 1884. This wasn't just due to hunting. It was also government policy aimed at destroying the Plains tribes' primary resource and forcing them onto reservations. Leaders like General Philip Sheridan supported this approach, reflecting the strategy of breaking indigenous resistance through environmental destruction. For Native Americans, westward expansion was an apocalyptic event, dismantling their economies, spiritual practices, and cultural identities. Early interactions sometimes involved trade, but by the 1870s, most indigenous groups faced three grim options: confinement to reservations, continued resistance, or cultural assimilation. The reservation system was a form of cultural genocide. Native children were taken from families and forced into boarding schools where they were stripped of their identities. These actions caused lasting trauma still felt today. Armed resistance almost always ended in defeat, although some victories, like the 1876 Battle of the Little Bighorn, were significant. In the years that followed, military retaliation became increasingly brutal, often targeting entire villages. This clash of cultures was especially tragic because many native nations had rich traditions, effective agricultural systems, and structured governance that could have taught settlers valuable lessons. But fundamental differences in land use and ownership concepts made peaceful coexistence difficult. Many native groups didn't believe land could be owned, making treaties deeply flawed from the beginning. Beyond native settler tensions, the West was home to a diverse population from around the world. This diversity brought strength and conflict. Chinese immigrants, crucial in railroad construction and mining, faced harsh racism. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act emerged from decades of anti-Chinese sentiment. Chinese miners were often removed from profitable claims or targeted by discriminatory laws. Mexican Americans, many of whom became U.S. citizens after the Mexican-American War, faced similar treatment. Despite treaties protecting their property, many lost their lands through legal trickery and intimidation. Traditional Spanish water rights were replaced by less suitable English legal systems. Even European immigrants struggled to fully integrate. National and religious identity shaped life on the frontier. Irish Catholics, German Lutherans, Scandinavian Protestants, and Eastern European Jews often built separate communities to preserve their heritage. While these communities offered support, they also became targets during periods of economic or social strain. African Americans who migrated west after the Civil War, seeking freedom from Southern racism, often encountered different but equally damaging forms of discrimination. Discrimination was widespread, Black cowboys, who made up about 25% of the workforce on some cattle operations, were rarely acknowledged in contemporary accounts or later mythology. Black homesteaders founded communities across several Western territories, but often encountered organized resistance from white neighbors and faced discriminatory enforcement of homestead laws. The interaction among these diverse groups, each with distinct values, practices, and expectations, produced frontier communities that were far more complex and conflict-ridden than later romantic portrayals suggested. The melting pot metaphor, later popularized in American mythology, concealed both the enduring cultural distinctions among groups and the power imbalances that determined which cultures were preserved and which were suppressed. As the day moves on, you find yourself in a frontier town amid rapid change, a transformation sweeping across the West during the 1870s and 1880s. The early phase of settlement, marked by individual prospectors, independent farmers, and small-scale businesses, was being replaced by large-scale corporate development. The arrival of railroads accelerated this shift. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, travel between East and West was reduced from months to days. Branch lines soon reached previously isolated regions, linking them to national markets and supply systems. This transportation revolution enabled the mass extraction of Western resources for Eastern industries, while factory-made Eastern goods flooded into Western markets. These new economic links further integrated Western regions into the national economy, but often to the detriment of small producers. Independent miners couldn't compete with corporations that had the capital and technology for large-scale operations. Family farms were undercut by agricultural enterprises that operated on vast tracts of land. Small ranchers were increasingly squeezed out by large cattle companies backed by investors and political allies. Corporate power didn't just dominate the economy, it shaped politics too. Railroad companies, mining conglomerates, timber interests, and major landholders wielded massive influence over territorial and early state governments. Access to water, minerals, grazing land, and timber was usually granted to those with wealth and political connections, rather than small operators or local communities. This shift from a raw frontier to a structured integrated region was not only economic, it was cultural. Rough mining camps and cattle towns gradually developed institutions that represented stability and a connection to the broader society. Banks, schools, churches, newspapers, theaters, and fraternal groups emerged. Streets were laid out and often paved. Wooden shacks were replaced with brick and stone buildings. Local governments passed regulations governing behaviors that had previously gone unregulated. For many, especially those drawn to the frontier for its freedom from Eastern rules, this transformation felt like an unwelcome domestication of wild spaces. Some moved further west, always chasing the next frontier. Others struggled to adjust to rising regulation, competition, and changing social norms. The so-called end of the frontier, marked by the 1890 census, was more than just a geographical milestone. It brought psychological and cultural upheaval for those whose identity was rooted in frontier life. Part of this change involved taming frontier violence. The famous gunfighters and outlaws who would later fill Western legends existed during a brief era when formal law enforcement was replacing older, informal systems of justice. By the 1880s and 1890s, most settled communities had professional police and court systems, though remote areas still experienced occasional outbursts of vigilante-style conflict resolution. Legendary figures like Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, and Jesse James operated in this transitional time, often shifting between legal and illegal roles as situations evolved. Later myths masked the complex, morally ambiguous nature of their lives. Hickok, far from being the flawless marksman of legend, accidentally shot innocent bystanders in gunfights. Earp's career included work as a lawman, gambler, brothel owner, and vigilante. Jesse James, often romanticized as a Robin Hood figure, was a former Confederate guerrilla whose robberies claimed innocent lives. As evening falls on your last day in the Wild West, you find yourself reflecting on the vast gap between the actual frontier experience and the mythology that came afterward. Why did Americans, and eventually the world, embrace such a romanticized version of this harsh period? What needs did these myths fulfill, and what truths did they hide? Part of the explanation lies in timing. The golden age of Western myth-making coincided with the closing of the real frontier. The disappearance of the frontier coincided with the rise of its mythologization. In the 1880s, Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows began staging dramatized versions of frontier life, Indian battles, stagecoach robberies, for Eastern audiences, even as railroads and telegraphs were integrating the West into mainstream society. These shows weren't accurate histories, but spectacles that matched Eastern fantasies of the West. Similarly, dime novels written in Eastern cities by authors with little first-hand knowledge, exaggerated tales of Western heroes using predictable plots and stark moral contrasts to present the West as a proving ground for American values like courage, self-reliance, and individualism. Hollywood Westerns later amplified this myth, producing iconic but fictional images: lone cowboys, brave sheriffs, wicked outlaws, and savage Indians. These portrayals, though disconnected from reality, served important psychological roles. They reassured Americans during times of social upheaval, portraying the nation's character as forged on the frontier and implying that U.S. expansion had been righteous and inevitable. The simplified good versus evil narratives also justified the nation's growing global power. Yet these myths concealed a far messier truth. Western development involved indigenous genocide, exploitation of immigrant workers, corporate domination of politics, environmental harm, and deep. Rather than moral clarity, the real West was a mix of resilience and brutality, a story of how societies cope with hardship, sometimes through solidarity, sometimes through oppression. As night falls on your final day in the unromanticized West, you reflect on the raw, unforgiving reality of frontier life. Modern comforts, abundant food, healthcare, safety, contrast sharply with the skills and toughness needed to survive in the 1870s. That world is almost unimaginable now, yet it still fascinates. Perhaps it's the immediacy of life, the deep interdependence of frontier communities, or the sheer endurance of people in harsh conditions. The legacy of the frontier reaches beyond myth into modern systems: property laws, water rights, state-federal dynamics, and resource policies. The diversity of Western communities, despite assimilation pressures, helped shape today's multicultural America. Even current debates about individual freedom versus collective responsibility echo frontier-era struggles. Debates about standards, exploitation, and conservation trace back to the frontier era. For Native Americans, this time marked not heroic expansion, but the destruction of ancient ways of life and the beginning of an ongoing fight for cultural survival and sovereignty. Their viewpoint challenges the celebratory narrative of Western settlement, emphasizing the rich civilizations that were disrupted and the vast knowledge lost. Understanding the frontier fully requires holding multiple perspectives, recognizing the bravery of settlers who formed new communities under harsh conditions while also acknowledging the suffering of those displaced. As you lie down on your final night in the Wild West, you're surrounded by the sensory details of a bygone era: the wind in the grass, a coyote's distant cry, maybe faint music from a saloon. These sounds once connected everyone on the frontier, regardless of who they were. The vast landscapes and tough climate shaped all who experienced them, creating a shared relationship with the land, even amid cultural divisions. Tomorrow, you'll return to your own time, carrying a deeper understanding of this pivotal period. Westerns and frontier novels will never seem the same. You'll see the clean narratives for what they are: simplified versions of a complicated truth. You'll gain a new appreciation for the security and comfort of modern life, the kind frontier dwellers couldn't even imagine. You might also grow more aware of the self-sufficiency we've lost, the ability to grow, repair, and create with limited resources. Most of all, you'll come to realize that the real story of the West lies not in gunfights or gold, but in the everyday experiences of ordinary people, men, women, and children of all backgrounds, who faced extreme challenges with limited means. Their legacy is found in the communities they built, the environmental changes they caused, the cultural habits they formed, and the myths that arose from their lives. The true Wild West disappeared long ago, transformed by technology, population, and infrastructure into today's urbanized West. Yet its influence remains in local traditions, land use, and regional identity. As you drift into sleep, the line between past and present fades. The issues faced by frontier communities, resource management, environmental limits, diverse populations, and the tension between freedom and cooperation still exist in modern forms. Perhaps the frontier's greatest legacy isn't in its answers, but in the questions it left behind about how people survive, build communities, and interact with the land. The stars above, once used for guidance and comfort, still shine. In that moment, you feel a connection to those who looked at the same sky over a century ago, facing the unknown. And as sleep takes you, you dream of a West that was raw, unforgiving, yet magnificent. A place where human struggle and resilience stood side by side, shaping a nation.